This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 4, Chapters 7 through 14.
Part 4, Chapter 7. The Canadians, who were in the Ypres salient in January 1916, and for a long time afterward, had a grim way of fighting. The enemy never knew what they might do next. When they were most quiet, they were most dangerous. They used cunning as well as courage, and went out on Red Indian adventures over no man's land for fierce and scientific slaughter. I remember one of their early raids in the salient, when a big party of them, all volunteers, went out one night with intent to get through the barbed wire outside a strong German position to do a lot of killing there. They had trained for the job and thought out every detail of this hunting expedition. They blacked their faces so that they would not show white in the enemy's flares. They fastened flash lamps to their bayonets so that they might see their victims. They wore rubber gloves to save their hands from being torn on the barbs of the wire. Stealthily they crawled over no man's land, crouching in shell holes every time a rocket rose and made a glimmer of light. They took their time at the wire, muffling the snap of it by bits of cloth. Reliefs crawled up with more gloves and even with tins of hot cocoa. Then, through the gap into the German trenches, and there were screams of German soldiers, terror shaken by the flash of light in their eyes, and black faces above them, and bayonets already red with blood. It was butcher's work, quick and skillful, like Red Indian scalping. 30 Germans were killed before the Canadians went back, with only 2 casualties. The Germans were horrified by this sudden slaughter. They dared not come out on patrol work. Canadian scouts crawled down to them and insulted them, ingeniously veiled, but could get no answer. Later they trained their machine guns on German working parties and swept crossroads on which supplies came up, and the Canadian sniper, in one shell hole or another, lay for hours in sulky patience and at last got his man. They had to pay for all this at Maple Copse in June of 15, as I shall tell. But it was a vendetta which did not end until the war ended, and the Canadians fought the Germans with a long, enduring, terrible, skillful patience which at last brought them to Mons on the day before armistice. I saw a good deal of the Canadians from first to last, and on many days of battle saw the tough, hard fighting spirit of these men. Their generals believed in common sense applied to war, and not in high mysteries and secret rites which cannot be known outside the circle of initiation. I was impressed by General Currie, whom I met for the first time in that winter of 191-516, and wrote at the time that I saw in him a leader of men who in open warfare might win great victories by doing the common sense thing rapidly and decisively, to the surprise of an enemy working by elaborate science. He would, I think, astound them by the simplicity of his smashing stroke. Those words of mine were fulfilled on the day when the Canadians helped to break the Drocourt-Queant line, and when they captured Cambrai, with English troops on their right, who shared their success. General Currie, who became the Canadian Corps commander, did not spare his men. He led them forward whatever the cost, but there was something great and terrible in his simplicity and sureness of judgment, and this real estate agent, as he was before he took to soldiering, was undoubtedly a man of strong ability, free from those trammels of red tape and tradition which swathed round so many of our own leaders. He cut clean to the heart of things, ruthlessly, like a surgeon, and as I watched that man, immense in bulk, with a heavy, thoughtful face and stern eyes that softened a little when he smiled, I thought of him as Oliver Cromwell. He was severe as a disciplinarian, and not beloved by many men, but his staff officers, who stood in awe of him, knew that he demanded truth and honesty, and that his brain moved quickly to sure decisions and saw big problems broadly and with understanding. He had good men with him, mostly amateurs, but with hard business heads and the same hatred of red tape and niggling ways which belonged to their chief. So the Canadian Corps became a powerful engine on our side when it had learned many lessons in blood and tragedy. They organized their publicity side in the same masterful way, and were determined that what Canada did the world should know and damn all censorship. They bought up English artists, photographers, and writing men to record their exploits. With Lord Beaverbrook in England, they engineered Canadian propaganda with immense energy, and Canada believed her men made up the British Army and did all the fighting. I do not blame them, and only wish that the English soldier should have been given his share of the honors that belonged to him, the lion's share. Part 4, Chapter 8. The Canadians were not the only men to go out raiding. It became part of the routine of war, that quick killing in the night, for English and Scottish and Irish and Welsh troops, and some had luck with it, and some men liked it, and to others it was a horror which they had to do, and always it was a fluky, nervy job when any accident might lead to tragedy. I remember one such raid by the 12th West Yorks in January of 15, which was typical of many others, before raids developed into minor battles with all the guns at work. There were 4 lieutenants who drew up the plan and called for volunteers, and it was one of these who went out first and alone to reconnoiter the ground and to find the best way through the German barbed wire. He just slipped out over the parapet and disappeared into the darkness. When he came back, he had a wound in the wrist. It was just the bad luck of a chance bullet, but brought invaluable knowledge. He had found a gap in the enemy's wire which would give an open door to the party of visitors. He had also tested the wire farther along and thought it could be cut without much bother. Good enough was the verdict, and a detachment started out for no man's land, divided into 2 parties. The enemy trenches were about 100 yards away, which seems a mile in the darkness and the loneliness of the dead ground. At regular intervals the German rockets flared up, so that the hedges and wire and parapets along their line were cut out ink, black against the white illumination, and the 2 patrols of Yorkshiremen who had been crawling forward stopped and crouched lower and felt themselves revealed, and then, when darkness hid them again, went on. The party on the left were now close to the German wire and under the shelter of a hedge. They felt their way along until the 2 subalterns who were leading came to the gap which had been reported by the first explorer. They listened intently and heard the German sentry stamping his feet and pacing up and down. Presently he began to whistle softly, utterly unconscious of the men so close to him, so close now that any stumble, any clatter of arms, any word spoken would betray them. The 2 lieutenants had their revolvers ready and crept forward to the parapet. The men had to act according to instinct now, for no order could be given, and one of them found his instinct led him to clamber right into the German trench, a few yards away from the sentry, but on the other side of the traverse. He had not been there long, holding his breath and crouching like a wolf, before footsteps came toward him and he saw the glint of a cigarette. It was a German officer going his round. The Yorkshire boy sprang onto the parapet again and lay across it with his head toward our lines and his legs dangling in the German trench. The German officer's cloak brushed his heels, but the boy twisted round a little and stared at him as he passed. But he passed, and presently the sentry began to whistle again, some old German tune which cheered him in his loneliness. He knew nothing of the eyes watching him through the darkness, nor of his nearness to death. It was the first lieutenant who tried to shoot him, but the revolver was muddy and would not fire. Perhaps a click disturbed the sentry. Anyhow, the moment had come for quick work. It was the sergeant who sprang upon him, down from the parapet with one pounce. A frightful shriek, with the shrill agony of a boy's voice, wailed through the silence. The sergeant had his hand about the German boy's throat and tried to strangle him and to stop another dreadful cry. The second officer made haste. He thrust his revolver close to the struggling sentry and shot him dead, through the neck, just as he was falling limp from a blow on the head given by the butt end of the weapon which had failed to fire. The bullet did its work, though it passed through the sergeant's hand, which had still held the man by the throat. The alarm had been raised and German soldiers were running to the rescue. "Quick," said one of the officers. There was a wild scramble over the parapet, a drop into the wet ditch, and a race for home over no man's land, which was white under the German flares and noisy with the waspish note of bullets. The other party were longer away and had greater trouble to find a way through, but they too got home, with one officer badly wounded, and wonderful luck to escape so lightly. The enemy suffered from the jumps for several nights afterward and threw bombs into their own barbed wire, as though the English were out there again, and at the sound of those bombs the West Yorks laughed all along their trenches. Part 4, Chapter 9. It was always astonishing, though afterward familiar in those battlefields of Flanders, to find oneself in the midst of so many nationalities and races and breeds of men belonging to that British family of ours which sent its sons to sacrifice. In those trenches there were all the ways of speech, all the sentiment of place and history, all the creeds and local customs and songs of old tradition which belong to the mixture of our blood wherever it is found about the world. The skirl of the Scottish bagpipes was heard through all the years of war over the Flemish marshlands, and there were Highlanders and Lowlanders with every dialect over the border. In one line of trenches the German soldiers listened to part songs sung in such trained harmony that it was as if a battalion of opera singers had come into the firing line. The Welshmen spoke their own language. For a time no officer received his command, unless he spoke it as fluently as running water by Aberystwyth, and even orders were given in this tongue, until a few Saxons, discovered in the ranks, failed to form fours and know their left hand from their right in Welsh. The French Canadians did not need to learn the language of the peasants in these market towns. Soldiers from Somerset used many old Saxon words which puzzled their Cockney friends, and the Lancashire men brought the northern burr with them, and the grit of the northern spirit. And Ireland, though she would not have conscription, sent some of the bravest of her boys out there, and in all the bloodiest battles since that day at Mons the old fighting qualities of the Irish race shone brightly again, and the blood of her race has been poured out upon these tragic fields. One of the villages behind the lines of Arras was so crowded with Irish boys at the beginning of 16 that I found it hard not to believe that a part of old Ireland itself had found its way to Flanders. In one old outhouse the cattle had not been evicted. 12 Flemish cows lay cuddled up together on the ground floor in damp straw, which gave out a sweet, sickly stench, while the Irish soldiers lived upstairs in the loft, to which they climbed up a tall ladder with broken rungs. I went up the ladder after them. It was very shaky in the middle, and, putting my head through the loft, gave a greeting to a number of dark figures lying in the same kind of straw that I had smelled downstairs. One boy was sitting with his back to the beams, playing a penny whistle very softly to himself, or perhaps to the rats under the straws. "The creatures are that bold," said a boy from County Cork, "that when we first came in they sat up smilling and sang God Save Ireland. Bedad, and it's the truth I'm after telling ye." The billets were wet and dirty, but it was good to be away from the shells, even if the rain came through the beams of a broken roof and soaked through the plaster of wattle walls. The Irish boys were good at making wood fires in these old barns and pigsties, if there were a few bricks about to make a hearth, and, sure, a baked potato was no Protestant with a grudge against the Pope. There were no such luxuries in the trenches when the Dublins and the Munsters were up in the firing line at the Hohenzollern. The shelling was so violent that it was difficult to get up the supplies, and some of the boys had to fall back on their iron rations. It was the only complaint which one of them made when I asked him what he thought of his first experience under fire. It was all right, sore, and not so bad as I'd been after thinking, if only my appetite had not been bigger than my belt, at all. The spirit of these Irishmen was shown by some who had just come out from the old country to join their comrades in the firing line. When the Germans put over a number of shells, smashing the trenches and wounding men, the temper of the lads broke out, and they wanted to get over the parapet and make a dash for the enemy. 'Twould teach 'em a lesson, they told their officers, who had some trouble in restraining them. These newcomers had to take part in the digging which goes on behind the lines at night out in the open, without the shelter of a trench. It was nervous work, especially when the German flares went up, silhouetting their figures on the skyline, and when one of the enemy's machine guns began to chatter. But the Irish boys found the heart for a jest, and one of them, resting on his spade a moment, stared over to the enemy's lines and said, "May the old devil take the spalpeen who works the typewriter." It was a scaring, nerve-wracking time for those who had come fresh to the trenches, some of those boys who had not guessed the realities of war until then. But they came out proudly with their tails up, said one of their officers after their baptism of fire. The drum and fife band of the Munsters was practicing in an old barn on the wayside, and presently, in honor of visitors who were myself and another, the pipers were sent for. They were 5 tall lads, who came striding down the street of Flemish cottages with the windbags under their arms, and then, with the fife men sitting on the straw around them, and the drummers standing with their sticks ready, they took their breath for the good old Irish tune demanded by the captain. It was a tune which men could not sing very safely in Irish yesterdays, and it held the passion of many rebellious hearts, and the yearning of them. "Oh, Paddy dear, and did you hear the news that's going round? The shamrock is forbid by law to grow on Irish ground. She's the most distressful country that ever yet was seen. They're hanging men and women there for wearing of the green." Then the pipers played the March of O'Neill, a wild old air as shrill and fierce as the spirit of the men who came with their Irish battle cries against Elizabeth's pikemen and Cromwell's Ironsides. I thought then that the lads who still stayed back in Ireland, and the old people there, would have been glad to stand with me outside that Flemish barn, and to hear the old tunes of their race played by the boys who were out there fighting. I think they would have wept a little, as I saw tears in the eyes of an Irish soldier by my side, for it was the spirit of Ireland herself, with all her poetry, and her valour, and her faith in liberty, which came crying from those pipes, and I wished that the sound of them could carry across the sea. That was a year before I saw the Irish battalions come out of Gibbs, a poor remnant of the strength that had gone in, all tattered and torn, and caked with the filth of battle, and hardly able to stagger along. But they pulled themselves up a little, and turned eyes left when they passed their brigadier, who called out words of praise to them. It was more than a year later than that when I saw the last of them, after a battle in Flanders, when they were massacred and lay in heaps round German redoubts, up there in the swamps. Part 4, Chapter 10. Early in the morning of February 23 there was a clear sky with a glint of sun in it, and airplanes were aloft, as though it would be a good flying day. But before midday the sky darkened and snow began to fall, and then it snowed steadily for hours, so that all the fields of Flanders were white. There was a strange, new beauty in the war zone which had changed all the pictures of war by a white enchantment. The villages where our soldiers were billeted looked as though they were expecting a visit from Santa Claus. The snow lay thick on the thatch and in soft, downy ridges on the red-tiled roofs. It covered, with its purity, the rubbish heaps in Flemish farmyards and the old oak beams of barns and sheds where British soldiers made their beds of straw. Away over the lonely country which led to the trenches, every furrow in the fields was a thin white ridge, and the trees, which were just showing a shimmer of green, stood ink black against the drifting snow clouds, with a long white streak down each tall trunk on the side nearest to the wind. The old windmills of Flanders which looked down upon the battlefields had been touched by the softly falling flakes, so that each rib of their sails, and each rung of their ladders, and each plank of their ancient timbers was outlined like a frosty cobweb. Along the roads of war our soldiers tramped through the blizzard, with ermine mantles over their mackintosh capes, and mounted men with their heads bent to the storm were like white knights riding through a white wilderness. The long columns of motor lorries, the gun limbers drawn up by their batteries, the field ambulances by the clearing hospitals were all cloaked in snow, and the tramp and traffic of an army were hushed in the great quietude. In the trenches the snow fell thickly and made white pillows of the piled sandbags, and snowmen of sentries standing in the shelter of the traverses. The tarpaulin roofs and timbered doorways of dugouts were so changed by the snowflakes that they seemed the dwelling places of fairy folks, or at least of Pierrot and Columbine in a Christmas hiding place, and not of soldiers stamping their feet and blowing on their fingers and keeping their rifles dry. In its first glamour of white the snow gave a beauty even to no man's land, making a lacework pattern of barbed wire, and lying very softly over the tumbled ground of mine fields, so that all the ugliness of destruction and death was hidden under this canopy. The snowflakes fluttered upon stark bodies there, and shrouded them tenderly. It was as though all the doves of peace were flying down to fold their wings above the obscene things of war. For a little while the snow brought something like peace. The guns were quieter, for artillery observation was impossible. There could be no sniping, for the scurrying flakes put a veil between the trenches. The airplanes which went up in the morning came down quickly to the powdered fields and took shelter in their sheds. A great hush was over the war zone, but there was something grim, suggestive of tragic drama, in this silent countryside, so white even in the darkness, where millions of men were waiting to kill one another. Behind the lines the joke of the snow was seen by soldiers, who were quick to see a chance of fun. Men who had been hurling bombs in the Ypres salient bombarded one another with hand grenades, which burst noiselessly except for the shouts of laughter that signaled a good hit. French soldiers were at the same game in one village I passed, where the snow fight was fast and furious, and some of our officers led an attack upon old comrades with the craft of trappers and an expert knowledge of enfilade fire. The white peace did not last long. The ermine mantle on the battlefield was stained by scarlet patches as soon as men could see to fight again. Part 4, Chapter 11. For some days in that February of 1916, the war correspondents in the chateau of Tilkers, from which they made their expeditions to the line, were snowed up like the army round them. Not even the motor cars could move through that snow which drifted across the roads. We sat indoors talking high treason sometimes, pondering over the problem of a war, from which there seemed no way out, becoming irritable with one another's company, becoming passionate in argument about the ethics of war, the purpose of man, the gospel of Christ, the guilt of Germany, and the dishonesty of British politicians. Futile, foolish arguments, while men were being killed in great numbers, as daily routine, without result. Officers of a division billeted nearby came in to dine with us, some of them generals with elaborate theories on war, and a passionate hatred of Germany, seeing no other evil in the world, some of them brigadiers with tales of appalling brutality, which caused great laughter, some of them battalion officers with the point of view of those who said, Morituri ti saluant. There was one whose conversation I remember, having taken notes of it before I turned in that night. It was a remarkable conversation, summing up many things of the same kind which I had heard in stray sentences by other officers, and month by month, years afterward, heard again, spoken with passion. This officer, who had come out to France in 1914, and had been fighting ever since, by a luck which had spared his life, when so many of his comrades had fallen round him, did not speak with passion. He spoke with a bitter, mocking irony. He said that Gibbs was a close corporation in the hands of the military clique who had muddled through the South African War, and were now going to muddle through a worse one. They were, he said, entrenched behind impregnable barricades of old, moss-eaten traditions, red tape, and caste privilege. They were, of course, patriots who believed that the empire depended upon their system. They had no doubt of their inherent right to conduct the war, which was their war, without interference or criticism or publicity. They spent many hours of the days and nights in writing letters to one another, and those who wrote most letters received most decorations and felt, with a patriotic fire within their breasts, that they were getting on with the war. Within their close corporation there were rivalries, intrigues, perjuries, and treacheries like those of a medieval court. Each general and staff officer had his followers and his sycophants, who jostled for one another's jobs, fawned on the great man, flattered his vanity, and made him believe in his omniscience. Among the general staff, there were various grades: GSO, IGSO, IGSO, III, and those in the lower grades fought for a higher grade with every kind of artfulness and diplomacy and backstair influence. They worked late into the night. That is to say, they went back to their offices after dining at mess, so frightfully busy, old man, and kept their lights burning, and smoked more cigarettes, and rang one another up on the telephone with futile questions, and invented new ways of preventing something from being down somewhere. The war to them was a far-off thing essential to their way of life, as miners in the coal fields are essential to statesmen in Downing Street, especially in cold weather, but it did not touch their souls or their bodies. They did not see its agony, or imagine it, or worry about it. They were always cheerful, breezy, bright with optimism. They made a little work go a long way. They were haughty and arrogant with subordinate officers, or at the best affable and condescending, and to superior officers they said, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," "Quite so, sir," to any statement, however absurd in its ignorance and dogmatism. If a major general said, "Wagner was a mountebank in music," GSO, I, who had once studied at Munich, said, "Yes, sir," or, "You think so, sir? Of course you're right." If a lieutenant colonel said Browning was not a poet, a staff captain, who had read Browning at Cambridge with passionate admiration, said, "I quite agree with you, sir. And who do you think was a poet, sir?" It was the army system. The opinion of a superior officer was correct, always. It did not admit of contradiction. It was not to be criticized. Its ignorance was wisdom. General Headquarters lived, said our guest, in a world of its own, rose-colored, remote from the ugly things of war. They had heard of the trenches, yes, but as the West End hears of the East End, a nasty place where common people lived. Occasionally they visited the trenches as society folk go slumming, and came back proud of having seen a shell burst, having braved the lice and the dirt. "The trenches are the slums," said our guest. "We are the great unwashed. We are the mud larks." There was a trench in the salient called J3. It was a way out in advance of our lines. It was not connected with our own trench system. It had been left derelict by both sides and was a ditch in no man's land. But our men were ordered to hold it to save sniping. A battalion commander protested to the headquarters staff. There was no object in holding J3. It was a target for German guns and a temptation to German miners. J3, came the staff command, must be held until further orders. We lost 500 men in holding it. The trench and all in it were thrown up by mines. Among those killed was the Honourable Lyndhurst Bruce, the husband of Camille Clifford, with other husbands of women unknown. Our guest told the story of the massacre in Neuve-Chapelle. "This is a death sentence," said the officers who were ordered to attack, but they attacked and died with great gallantry, as usual. "In the slums," said our guest, "we are expected to die if General Headquarters tells us so, or if the Corps arranges our funeral. And generally we do." That night, when the snow lay on the ground, I listened to the rumbling of the gunning away in the salient and seemed to hear the groans of men at Hooge, at St. Eloi, in other awful places. The irony of that guest of ours was frightful. It was bitter beyond justice, though with truth in the mockery, the truth of a soul shocked by the waste of life and heroism. When I met him later in the war, he was on the staff. Part 4, Chapter 12. The world our side of it held its breath and felt its own heart beat when, in February of that year 15, the armies of the German Crown Prince launched their offensive against the French at Verdun. It was the biggest offensive since their first drive down to the Marne. And as the days passed, and they hurled fresh masses of men against the French and brought up new guns to replace their losses, there was no doubt that in this battle the Germans were trying by all their weight to smash their way to victory through the walls which the French had built against them by living flesh and spirit. Will they hold? Was the question which every man among us asked of his neighbor and of his soul. On our front there was nothing of war beyond the daily routine of the trenches and the daily list of deaths and wounds. Winter had closed down upon us in Flanders, and through its fogs and snows came the news of that conflict round Verdun to the waiting army, which was ours. The news was bad, yet not the worst. Poring over maps of the French front, we in our winter quarters saw with secret terror, some of us with a bluster of false optimism, some of us with unjustified despair, that the French were giving ground slowly, after heroic resistance, after dreadful massacre, and steadily. They were falling back to the inner line of forts, hard-pressed. The Germans, in spite of monstrous losses under the flail of the Soixante-Quinzes, were forcing their way from slope to slope, capturing positions which all but dominated the whole of the Verdun heights. "If the French break, we shall lose the war," said the pessimist. "The French will never lose Verdun," said the optimist. "Why not? What are your reasons beyond that cursed optimism which has been our ruin? Why announce things like that, as though divinely inspired? For God's sake, let us stare straight at the facts. The Germans are losing the war by this attack on Verdun. They are just pouring their best soldiers into the furnace, burning the flower of their army. It is our gain. It will lead in the end to our victory. But my dear good fool, what about the French losses? Don't they get killed too? The German artillery is flogging them with shell fire from 17-inch guns, 12-inch, 9-inch, every bloody and monstrous engine. The French are weak in heavy artillery. For that error, which has haunted them from the beginning, they are now paying with their life's blood, the lifeblood of France. You are arguing on emotion and fear. Haven't you learned yet that the attacking side always loses more than the defense? That is a sweeping statement. It depends on relative man power and gun power. Given a superiority of guns and men, an attack is cheap. Defense is blown off the earth. Otherwise, how could we ever hope to win? I agree. But the forces at Verdun are about equal, and the French have the advantage of position. The Germans are committing suicide. Humbug. They know what they are doing. They are the greatest soldiers in Europe. Led by men with bone heads. By great scientists. By the traditional rules of medievalism. By bald-headed vultures in spectacles with brains like penny in the slot machines. Put in a penny and out comes a rule of war. Mad egoists, colossal blunderers, efficient in all things but knowledge of life. Then God help our British General Headquarters. A long silence. The silence of men who see monstrous forces at work, in which human lives are tossed like straws in flame. A silence reaching back to old ghosts of history, reaching out to supernatural aid. Then from one speaker or another a kind of curse and a kind of prayer. Hell, God help us all. So it was in our mess where war correspondents and censors sat down together after futile journeys to dirty places to see a bit of shell fire, a few dead bodies, a line of German trenches through a periscope, a queue of wounded men outside a dressing station, the survivors of a trench raid, a bombardment before a minor operation, a trench mortar stunt, a new part of the line. Verdun was the only thing that mattered in March and April, until France had saved herself and all of us. Part 4, Chapter 13. The British Army took no part in that Battle of Verdun, but rendered great service to France at that time. By February of 1915, we had taken over a new line of front, extending from our positions round Luce southward to the country round Lens and Arras. It was to this movement in February that Marshal Joffre made allusion when, in a message to our Commander-in-Chief on March 2D, he said that the French army remembered that its recent call on the comradeship of the British army met with an immediate and complete response. By liberating an immense number of French troops of the 10th Army and a mass of artillery from this part of the front, we had the good fortune to be of great service to France at a time when she needed many men and guns to repel the assault upon Verdun. Some of her finest troops, men who had fought in many battles and had held the trenches with most dogged courage, were here in this sector of the Western Front, and many batteries of heavy and light artillery had been in these positions since the early months of the war. It was, therefore, giving a new and formidable strength to the defense of Verdun when British troops replaced them at the time the enemy made his great attack. The French went away from this part of their battlefront with regret and emotion. To them it was sacred ground, this line from the long ridge of Notre-Dame de Lorette, past Arras, the old capital of Artois, to Hebuterne, where it linked up with the British army already on the Somme. Every field here was a graveyard of their heroic dead. I went over all the ground which we now held, and saw the visible reminders of all that fighting which lay strewn there, and told the story of all the struggle there by the upheaval of earth, the wreckage of old trenches, the mine craters and shell holes, and the litter of battle in every part of that countryside. I went there first to the hill of Notre-Dame de Lorette, looking northward to Lens, and facing the Vimy Ridge, which the enemy held as a strong barrier against us above the village of Sauches and Ablain-Saint-Nazaire and Neuville-Saint-Vaast, which the French had captured when they were still there. And I am glad of that, for I saw in their places the men who had lived there and fought there, as one may read in the terrible and tragic narrative of war by Henri Barbus in Lifo. I went on such a day as Barbus describes. Never once did he admit any fine weather to alleviate the suffering of his comrades, thereby exaggerating their misery somewhat. It was raining, and there was a white, dank mist through the trees of the Bois de Bouvigny on the way to the spur of Notre Dame. It clung to the undergrowth, which was torn by shell fire, and to every blade of grass growing rankly round the lips of shell craters in which were bits of red rag or old bones, the red pantaloons of the first French armies, who had fought through those woods in the beginning of the war. I roamed about a graveyard there, where shells had smashed down some of the crosses, but had not damaged the memorial to the men who had stormed up the slope of Notre-Dame de Lorette and had fallen when their comrades chased the Germans to the village below. A few shells came over the hill as I pushed through the undergrowth with a French captain, and they burst among the trees with shattering boughs. I remember that little officer in a steel helmet, and I could see a Norman knight as his ancestor with a falcon as his crest. He stood so often on the skyline, in full view of the enemy. I was thankful for the mist, that I admired but deplored his audacity. Without any screen to hide us, we walked down the hillside, gathering clots of greasy mud in our boots, stumbling and once sprawling. Another French captain joined us and became the guide. "This road is often Marmite," he said, "but I have escaped so often I have a kind of fatalism." I envied his faith, remembering 2 8-inch shells, which a few minutes before had burst in our immediate neighborhood, cutting off twigs of trees, and one branch with a scatter of steel, as sharp as knives and as heavy as sledge-hammers. Then for the first time I went into Ablain-Saint-Nazaire, which afterward I passed through scores of times on the way to Vimy when that ridge was ours. The ragged ruin of its church was white and ghostly in the mist. On the right of the winding road which led through it was Sauches Wood, all blasted and riven, and beyond a huddle of bricks which once was Sauches village. "Our men have fallen on every yard of this ground," said the French officer. "Their bodies lie thick below the soil. Poor France, poor France." He spoke with tragedy in his eyes and voice, seeing the vision of all that youth of France which even then, in March of 16, had been offered up in vast sacrifice to the greedy devils of war. Rain was slashing down now, beating a tattoo on the steel helmets of a body of French soldiers who stood shivering by the ruined walls while trench mortars were making a tumult in the neighborhood. They were the men of Henri Barbus, his comrades. There were middle-aged men and boys mixed together in a confraternity of misery. They were plastered with wet clay, and their boots were enlarged grotesquely by the clots of mud on them. Their blue coats were soddened, and the water dripped out of them and made pools round their feet. They were unshaven, and their wet faces were smeared with the soil of the trenches. "How goes it?" said the French captain with me. "It does not go," said the French sergeant. "Crie nom de Dieu. My men are not gay today. They have been wet for 3 weeks and their bones are aching. This place is not a bowl to bore in. If we light even a little fire, we ask for trouble. At the sight of smoke, the dirty boat starts shelling again. So we do not get dry, and we have no warmth, and we cannot make even a cup of good hot coffee. That dirty Boche up there on Vimy looks out of his deep tunnels and laughs up his sleeve and says those poor devils of Frenchmen are not gay today. That is true, mon capitaine. Mais, que voulez-vous? C'est pour la France. Oui, c'est pour la France. The French captain turned away, and I could see that he pitied those comrades of his as we went over cratered earth to the village of Neufville-Saint-Vaast. Poor fellows, he said presently. Not even a cup of hot coffee, that is war. Blood and misery. Glory, yes, afterward. But at what a price. So we came to Neufville-Saint-Vaast, a large village once with a fine church, old in history, a schoolhouse, a town hall, many little streets of comfortable houses under the shelter of the friendly old hill of Vimy, and within easy walk of Arras. Then, a frightful rubbish, heap mingled with unexploded shells, the twisted iron of babies' perambulators, bits of dead bodies, and shattered farm carts. 2 French soldiers carried a stretcher on which a heavy burden lay under a blood-soaked blanket. "It is a bad wound?" asked the captain. The men laid the stretcher down, breathing hard, and uncovered a face waxen the color of death. It was the face of a handsome man with a pointed beard, breathing snuffily through his nose. "He may live as far as the dressing station," said one of the Frenchmen. "It was a trench mortar which blew a hole in his body just now, over there." The man jerked his head toward a barricade of sandbags at the end of a street of ruin. 2 other men walked slowly toward us with a queer, hobbling gait. Both of them were wounded in the legs and had tied rags round their wounds tightly. They looked grave, almost sullen, staring at us as they passed, with brooding eyes. "The German trench mortars are very evil," said the captain. We poked about the ruins, raising our heads cautiously above sandbags to look at the German lines cut into the lower slopes of Vimy and thrust out by communication trenches to the edge of the village in which we walked. A boy officer came up out of a hole and saluted the captain, who stepped back and said, in an emotional way, "Tiens, c'est toi, Edward." "Oui, mon capitaine." The boy had a fine, delicate Latin face with dark eyes and long black eyelashes. "You are a lieutenant, then? How does it go, Edward?" "It does not go," answered the boy like that French sergeant in Ablain Saint-Nazaire. "This is a bad place. I lose my men every day. There were 3 killed yesterday, and 6 wounded. Today already there are 2 killed and 10 wounded." Something broke in his voice. "Ce n'est pas bon du tout, du tout. It is not good at all, at all." The captain clapped him on the shoulders, tried to cheer him. "Courage, mon vieux." The rain shot down on us. Our feet slithered in deep, greasy mud. Sharp stabs of flame vomited out of the slopes of Vimy. There was the high, long-drawn scream of shells in flight to Notre-Dame de Lorette. Batteries of 60 Quinzes were firing rapidly, and the shells cut through the air above us like scythes. The cauldron in this pit of war was being stirred up. Another wounded poilu was carried past us, covered by a bloody blanket like the other one. From slimy sandbags and wet ruins came the sickening stench of human corruption. A boot with some pulp inside protruded from a mud bank where I stood, and there was a human head, without eyes or nose, black and rotting in the puddle of a shell hole. Those were relics of a battle on May 9th, a year before, when swarms of boys of the 16 class, boys of 18, the flower of French youth, rushed forward from the crossroads at La Targette, a few hundred yards away, to capture these ruins of Neufville-Saint-Vaast. They captured them, and it cost them 7,000 in killed, and wounded at least 3,000 dead. They fought like young demons through the flaming streets. They fell in heaps under the German barrage fire. Machine guns cut them down as though they were ripe corn under the sickle. But these French boys broke the Prussian guard that day. Round about, over all this ground below Notre-Dame de Lorette and the fields round Suchez, the French had fought ferociously, burrowing below earth at the labyrinth, sapping, mining, gaining a network of trenches, an isolated house, a huddle of ruins. A German sap head, by frequent rushes and the frenzy of those who fight with their teeth and hands, flinging themselves on the bodies of their enemy, below ground in the darkness, or above ground between ditches and sandbags. So for something like 15 months they fought, by Suchez and the labyrinth, until in February of 16 they went away after greeting our khaki men, who came into their old places, and found the bones and bodies of Frenchmen there, as I found white, rat-gnawed bones in disused trenches below Notre Dame when the rain washed the earth down and uncovered them. Part 4, Chapter 14. It was then, in that February of 15, that the city of Arras passed for defense into British hands and became from that time on one of our strongholds on the edge of the battlefields, so that it will be haunted forever by the ghosts of those men of ours whom I saw there on many days of grim fighting, month after month, in snow and sun and rain, in steel helmets and stink coats, in muddy khaki and kilts, in queues of wounded, 3,000 at a time outside the citadel, in billets where their laughter and music were scornful of high velocities, in the surging tide of traffic that poured through to victory that cost as much sometimes as defeat. When I first went into Arras during its occupation by the French, I remembered a day, 15 months before, near the town of St. Paul in Artois, where I was caught up in one of those tides of fugitives which in those early days of war used to roll back in a state of terror before the German invasion. Where do they come from? I asked, watching this long procession of gigs and farmers' carts and tramping women and children. The answer told me everything. They are bombarding Arras, monsieur. Since then, they had never ceased to bombard Arras. From many points of view, as I had come through the countryside at night, I had seen the flashes of shells over that city and had thought of the agony inside. 4 days before I went in first, it was bombarded with 150 17-inch shells, each one of which would destroy a cathedral. It was with a sense of being near to death, not a pleasant feeling. You understand that I went into Arras for the first time and saw what had happened to it. I was very near to the Germans, no more than 10 yards away, when I stood peering through a hole in the wall of the Maison Rouge. In the suburb of Blagny, it was a red brick villa, torn by shells, with a piano in the parlor, which no man dared to play. Behind a shelter of sandbags, and no more than 200 yards away from the enemy's lines, when I paced up and down the great railway station of Arras, where no trains ever travelled. For more than a year the enemy had been encamped outside the city, and for all that time had tried to batter a way into and through it. An endless battle had surged up against its walls, but in spite of all their desperate attacks no German soldier had set foot inside the city, except as a prisoner of war. Many thousands of young Frenchmen had given their blood to save it. The enemy had not been able to prevail over flesh and blood and the spirit of heroic men, but he had destroyed the city bit by bit. It was pitiful beyond all expression. It was worse than looking upon a woman whose beauty had been scarred by bloody usage. For Arras was a city of beauty, a living expression in stone of all the idealism in 800 years of history, a most sweet and gracious place. Even then, after a year's bombardment, some spiritual exhalation of human love and art came to one out of all this ruin. When I entered the city and wandered a little in its public gardens before going into its dead heart, the grand place, I felt the strange survival. The trees here were slashed by shrapnel. Enormous shell craters had ploughed up those pleasure grounds. The shrubberies were beaten down. Almost every house had been hit. Every building was scarred and slashed, but for the most part the city still stood, so that I went through many long streets and past long lines of houses, all deserted, all dreadful in their silence and desolation and ruin. Then I came to the Cathedral of St. Vaast. It was an enormous building of the Renaissance, not beautiful, but impressive in its spaciousness and dignity. Next to it was the bishop's palace, with long corridors and halls, and a private chapel. Upon these walls and domes the fury of great shells had spent itself. Pillars as wide in girth as giant trees had been snapped off to the base. The dome of the cathedral opened with a yawning chasm. High explosives burst through the walls. The keystones of arches were blown out, and masses of masonry were piled into the nave and aisles. As I stood there, rooks had perched in the broken vaulting and flew with noisy wings above the ruined altars. Another sound came like a great beating of wings with a swifter rush. It was a shell, and the vibration of it stirred the crumbling masonry, and bits of it fell with a clatter to the littered floor. On the way to the ruin of the bishop's chapel, I passed a group of stone figures. They were the famous angels of Arras removed from some other part of the building to what might have been a safer place. Now they were fallen angels, mangled as they lay. But in the chapel beyond, where the light streamed through the broken panes of stained glass windows, one figure stood untouched in all this ruin. It was a tall statue of Christ, standing in an attitude of meekness and sorrow, as though in the presence of those who crucified him. Yet something more wonderful than this scene of tragedy lived in the midst of it. Yet there were still people living in Aras. They lived an underground life, for the most part, coming up from the underworld to blink in the sunlight, to mutter a prayer or a curse or two, to gaze for a moment at any change made by a new day's bombardment, and then to burrow down again at the shock of a gun. Through low archways just above the pavement, I looked down into some of the deep vaulted cellars where the merchants used to stock their wine, and saw old women, and sometimes young women there, cooking over little stoves, pottering about iron bedsteads, busy with domestic work. Some of them looked up as I passed, and my eyes and theirs stared into each other. The women's faces were lined, and their eyes sunken. They had the look of people who have lived through many agonies and have more to suffer. Not all these citizens of Aras were below ground. There was a greengrocer's shop still carrying on a little trade. I went into another shop and bought some picture postcards of the ruins within a few yards of it. The woman behind the counter was a comely soul, and laughed because she had no change. Only 2 days before a 17-inch shell had burst 50 yards or so away from her shop, which was close enough for death. I marveled at the risk she took with cheerful smiles. Was it courage or stupidity? One of the old women in the street grasped my arm in a friendly way and called me Chirpitadami, and described how she had been nearly killed 100 times. When I asked her why she stayed, she gave an old woman's cackling laugh and said, "Que voulez-vous, jeune homme?" which did not seem a satisfactory answer. As dusk crept into the streets of Aras, I saw small groups of boys and girls. They seemed to come out of holes in the ground to stare at this Englishman in khaki. "Are you afraid of the shells?" I asked. They grimaced up at the sky and giggled. They had got used to the hell of it all, and dodged death as they would a man with a whip, shouting with laughter beyond the length of his lash. In one of the vaulted cellars underground, when English soldiers first went in, there lived a group of girls who gave them wine to drink, and kisses for a franc or two, and the first cup of pleasure, if they had time to stay. Overhead shells were howling. Their city was stricken with death. These women lived like witches in a cave, a strange and dreadful life. I walked to the suburb of Blangy by way of St. Nicholas and came to a sinister place. Along the high road from Aras to Douai was a great factory of some kind, probably for beet sugar, and then a street of small houses with backyards and gardens much like those in our own suburbs. Holes had been knocked through the walls of the factory and houses, the gardens had been barricaded with barbed wire and sandbags, and the passage from house to house and between the overturned boilers of the factory formed a communication trench to the advanced outpost in the last house held by the French, on the other side of which is the enemy. As we made our way through these ruined houses, we had to walk very quietly and to speak in whispers. In the last house of all, which was a combination of fort and dugout, absolute silence was necessary, for there were German soldiers only 10 yards away, with trench mortars and bombs and rifles always ready to snipe across the walls. Through a chink no wider than my finger, I could see the red brick ruins of the houses inhabited by the enemy, and the road to Douai. The road to Douai, as seen through this chink, was a tangle of broken bricks. The enemy was so close to Aras, when the French held it, that there were many places where one had to step quietly and duck one's head, or get behind the shelter of a broken wall, to avoid a sniper's bullet or the rattle of bullets from a machine gun. As I left Aras in that November evening, darkness closed in its ruined streets and shells were crashing over the city from French guns, answered now and then by enemy batteries. But in a moment of rare silence, I heard the chime of a church clock. It seemed like the sweet voice of that old-time peace in Aras before the days of its agony, and I thought of that solitary bell sounding above the ruins in a ghostly way.
This concludes the 9th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for Free.